I am absolutely thrilled to announce the Icarus Fringe and Film Festival coming up June 8th to the 11th at the William Carlos Williams Center in Rutherford, New Jersey. This will be a 4-day immense festival featuring the stars of the dissident left and right, including Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, Nick Gillespie, Michael Tracy, Jeffrey Schollenberger, Sam Husseini, Jeffrey Tucker, Gene Epstein, Jeremy Kaufman, and Ben Burgis. To get your tickets to the Icarus Festival, go to icarusfest.com, and I'll see you there. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Michael Weimer, we are here to do a very long overdue Ask Me Anything episode of Unregistered. It's been a very long time, and many people have asked me about it, and I decided, finally, let's go. So we got some questions together from patrons of Unregistered, who are the only people on Earth privileged enough to participate in this. The only questions we have, all the questions we have are from patrons, and if you would like to become a patron, go to patreon.com/unregistered and join up, I think, at any level to do this. I believe that's right. So yeah, I'm ready to go, man. Fire away.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, first of all, how are you doing? Are you still going to the boxing gym?
No, I've had some health issues that fortunately are clearing up finally, but it's been a while. I injured my foot badly kicking a heavy bag a year ago, and yeah, I had trouble walking for a while, but that's pretty much healed up now. It's a weird, long-lasting injury. And then I have this nerve damage issue that I've told you about that is not exactly public, but that's also getting cleared up. So amazingly, after 6 years of it. But yeah, your homie right here has actually been in some physical suffering over the last several years that I haven't really talked about, but it's affected some things in my life, and especially my ability to sit and work, because the nerve damage thing actually is related to that. So I actually have pain whenever I sit. So yeah, so everyone should feel sorry for me. And also I now have a ready excuse for every mistake I make, because I'm being distracted by the pain. It's not, by the way, like pain. No one should cry about this. It's more like usually like a mild discomfort when I'm sitting in a chair like this. But like when I drive, for some reason, driving a car is just like horrendous, an ordeal. But anyway, I have finally found a specialist at UCSF, which is one of the top medical centers in the world. And I'm going to be seeing him next month, but it's already, even without him, it's already started getting better. So things are looking up for me in that regard. But yeah, that's how I'm doing. A little like too much information, but yeah, that's really what's happening. Since all I do is like live like, you know, through a screen and in my body, right? When you're like an online person, that's kind of your whole existence. It's this bizarre, very limited physical existence. Yeah, right. So there you have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were sharing some videos in the Discord of some MMA stuff, and it's always funny when like a normal guy at the gym, like a buff guy at the gym, like asks an MMA fighter to like try out a leg kick just to see what it feels like, and then he's like on the ground like crying after like a half-speed leg kick from somebody who knows what they're doing.
Oh yeah, God, getting kicked with the shin bone basically just touching the shin bone or being touched by it is shockingly painful. And you don't know about that until you do kickboxing. I mean, that's why you always wear pads, because that thing is just, there's something about the nerves in your shin bone and also the sharpness of the bone. So when you hit someone else with it, oof, it's staggering.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if like you properly block a kick, it still hurts. Like there's nothing you can do to stop it from hurting. You just hopefully stop yourself from getting injured.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the only thing you can do is just kick thousands and thousands of times and then progressively harder and harder targets, to basically you just numb your shin. And then the same with your thigh, your inner and outer thigh, because that's where you take a lot of the kicks. You just get kicked a lot. And I remember when I was training Muay Thai like 6 days a week, I did that for a couple of years. I remember just like, I love that feeling of having my whole outer thighs and some of my inner thighs were just sore all the time and kind of sort of always in a state of bruise. But like, I love that feeling. I just felt like, I don't know, I felt alive. I felt that was the one place where it wasn't just in a screen or in my body sitting in a chair, you know. My physical existence sort of existed in those three planes in a sense. But yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I miss it. I want to get back. I love martial arts. I love the gym. I love it to pieces. And it was like the happiest thing for me for like a decade, or more actually. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I've extolled the virtues of it to everybody who cares to listen. I love training people. I love teaching people. Actually, if I could make it work, I would seriously consider being a boxing coach. I really love teaching, and I love teaching this sport especially. Yeah.
Nice, nice, yeah. Okay, so the Norman Finkelstein episode was
Yeah.
recently out.
My goodness
Got a
gracious.
lot of attention. Yeah.
I got to say something about that. So my son texted me and he said something like, "This is the greatest moment of my life." He just thought it was so entertaining and hilarious. And I said, "Is that because of the New York Jew thing?" Because my son was born in Brooklyn. His mother's Jewish. I'm part Jewish. He was around New York Jews, so he knows what that means. Um, and it wasn't that, I guess, but Norman is a pretty funny guy. I mean, I think sort of intentionally, he's just he has a wit and he doesn't mind using it, which is something that's unusual these days. Think about political discourse. There used to be some writers like Christopher Hitchens was one who employed wit all the time, and irony, and had sort of in a certain sense, a lighthearted tone or approach to politics, or just a humorous tone. You don't get that anymore. And this is the left and the right, wouldn't you say, Mr. Weimer? Because this is in your bailiwick, being a comedy fan. Um, don't you think like that's declined also, just with the level of political discourse in general?
Yeah, there's a G.K. Chesterton quote. I think
Right,
it's "The angels fly because they take themselves so lightly."
right.
And that used to be the spirit of old school conservatism. And nowadays, conservatism has just gotten very vindictive, at least in the United States. In Europe, you've got like Peter Hitchens is still around, and like Stephen Hicks. He's not a conservative, but you got like these classical liberals that still try to be funny and try to be lighthearted and good company with the people that they're with. But yeah, in the United States especially, it's just war every time you talk.
It's war. Yeah, vindictive is a perfect word for, I would say, contemporary conservatism. Although I also understand why they're so vindictive. I would be probably too if I had been persecuted the way they have been in recent years. But yes, I mean, the left are sort of notoriously scolds, school marmish scolds. I mean, the left has never really had a sense of humor, except fringes of it in the 60s with the counterculture, Abby Hoffman, the Yippies. That was a beautiful little movement, by the way, that everyone should look into. I mean, that was truly using actually funny, intelligent humor to make very important political points, usually about war, by the way. Imagine that. Imagine that, Michael. Imagine if the left used humor to attack the US war right now. Like, wow. Like, they are so far from being useful. They are so far from that. Of course, they're pro-war, very pro-war. And using humor in politics to them is anathema, because to them it's a moral crusade. This is, an epic battle going on between the forces of good and evil, right? Between fascism and democracy, between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. There's no room for humor. You can't, that's making fun of people suffering and oppression. That shit's not funny. People's victimization is not funny. And so there we are. And then they go and smash the heads of conservatives in various ways. The conservatives get justifiably very hurt about this. They're in no mood for humor either at that point. And so there we have it. There you have a dialogue of just anger and hatred. I cannot have an explanation for why this is, except for just the general moralistic character of American culture. American culture has always been, Europeans have always said this, just highly moralistic in Christian ways, basically. And that's mostly for the left, as a matter of fact. Very Christian in their morality, in their sensibility, in their attitudes, and often in their behavior. That left-wingers and liberals in this country are more likely to be members of a nuclear family, are more likely to have long-lasting marriages. They have lower divorce rates, which completely comports with my experience, having lived among these people my entire life. They're all about bourgeois norms. They're all about family norms, very traditional American norms of the nuclear family. Every damn liberal I've ever known, pretty much, and I've known quite a few in New York City and San Francisco, they all aspired to be moms and dads, right? And that was it. And
Conservatives
being the best possible parents, so that we could then hover over our children all the time, managing every iota of their lives, and thus creating your generation who, besides you, is a bunch of losers.
Conservatives bring up that point a lot to call the left hypocrites when they talk about family values, in that, like, you don't preach the values that you live by, you liberals. I want to correct real quick. I meant to say Stephen Fry, not Stephen Hicks.
Oh,
Stephen Fry, the comedian. Yeah, not Stephen Hicks, the philosophy guy.
Oh, Stephen, you mean the philosophy guy who wrote a book about something that he never read? Right.
The postmodernism book, and the Nietzsche book.
Yeah, I'm going to say that publicly. He never, if you read Stephen Hicks's book, I've never said this publicly. If you read his book and you know anything at all about Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard, etc., you can immediately see that he never actually read any of their books, because guess what? There is not a single solitary quote from any of their actual work in that whole book, his book on attacking postmodernism. If you're going to attack something, you might want to quote something from it, like one thing. There's no words from Foucault or Derrida or Lyotard in that whole book. It's quite something. And the right wing holds him up as like the expert on postmodernism. And he's the reason we know that postmodernism is stupid and evil. He doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. Anyway, and I found that out when I debated him too. You could tell just the way he talked about it. If you've read any of these works, you can tell the guy's never read this stuff. Anyway, sorry, family. Yeah, liberals are they're the conservatives. They're the bourgeois, they're the upholders of bourgeois norms. Think about your typical Trump voter, right? And think about the family they most likely live in or probably don't, right? I mean, that demographic, they're the ones with broken families. They're the ones with a huge divorce rate. They're the ones with teenage pregnancies. They're the ones with just, a catastrophe. And that's probably why they are the great upholders of family values. That's probably why they're the ones screaming about these things all the time, because they're the ones suffering. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. I know where you're coming from there. So we're talking about this ties into something else. So, like, why is the right so vindictive, right now? I think it has to do with what was it, Andrew Breitbart and now Mike Cernovich, and just this general trend of realizing that the left in the United States are radicals. They're Saul Alinsky types. And at some point 10, 15 years ago, they started to say, hey, let's adopt the Saul Alinsky tactics ourselves and be just as evil and mean as Antifa or George Soros.
Yeah.
So this has to do with postmodernism. You're a proponent of postmodernism, and postmodernism coming out of a tradition of the left. Do you see a postmodernist to Machiavellian pipeline, in that if you use postmodernism to abandon your principles, you
Sure.
fill the void with your most Manichaean desires.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to me, postmodernism, the way that I employ it, um, is in the service of a politics of self-interest. And I've said this for many, many years, my politics is a politics of self-interest. I counsel self-interest. I wish that people acted politically. They do all the time in their personal lives, but act politically in their self-interest. In fact, I would kind of invert the way the left thinks about these things, right? If you know a leftist, you know a person who doesn't give a fuck about the people around them, but they care a whole lot about the people of Bangladesh, right? Or they care, or even more abstractly, they just care about the people, right? They talk literally.
Okay, real quick.
Yeah.
Can I draw a parallel here? There's a lot of conservatives who don't give a flying whatever about their family, but they'll talk forever about unborn babies or trans kids.
Oh, totally. That's the right-wing version of it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I wrote a piece for Reason many years ago about the animal rights movement among the left, like hardcore leftists, right, who always are speaking about how animals are being oppressed when animals never speak for themselves. And I compared that to the right wing's, view of the fetus, right? They're always speaking. I mean, they know exactly what the fetus is thinking and doing and wanting and desiring and who it is and what it is and the character. So they're doing sock puppetry in both cases. No, I mean, the conservatives do it similarly, although I'm just saying that I'm talking about the actual personal characteristics of liberals versus conservatives. In my experience, I've known lots of both, actually, because I knew all liberals as a kid, and then later on, I've known a lot of conservatives. That liberals and leftists mostly, actually, I'd say liberals and leftists care very little about the people in their actual lives and care a whole lot about the abstract people. Whereas conservatives tend to be, and this just comports with their ideology, they tend to be more focused on family, their own family, town, locality, and less so about the abstract people, or not at all so. I mean, and I love them for that. No, they shouldn't be thinking about the abstract people, because that doesn't exist. That's a construct that does no one any good. Even talking about the people of Bangladesh or the people of South Africa or the people of some other country, people of Ukraine, unless you actually are there and have been there, this is a meaningless concept. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, so I would like people to think a lot about the people in their own lives, and care very little. I guess I'm conservative in this way, typically. I guess maybe that's my problem. I mean, fundamentally, and that's why I left the left. My personality, I think, is that. Although I care a whole lot, I have cared a whole lot about the people. I mean, people have heard me on this very show caring a lot about the people. I have been known to even cry in public about the people in some form or another. I mean, never that abstract, but, like the victims of war, I have cried and felt very, very bad about that. People I've never known, whose names I don't even know. I know nothing about them. They don't, that's an interesting thing. And I think that's a Christian impulse. And I just think that is the impulse that animates Christianity. And even though I was raised in an atheist household, I still lived in a Christian culture. And my parents both came from Christian families. So the culture, the morality, the deep-seated morality had to shape their ethics, even when they were socialists and hippies and all that. And that gets passed down to me as a framework through which to see the world, just like almost all Americans, right? We all basically are given this sort of Christian moral framework through which to see the world. And you'll be hard pressed to find a law that's been passed that doesn't somehow comport with the way that Judeo-Christianity is interpreted. Steve Bannon and Trump are right. It is a Judeo-Christian nation for sure. And that even is true for many subcultures. Even like African-American working class culture has some Christian components to it for sure. But even punk rock has had some Christian components to it. So there's a lot of caring about acting on behalf of the abstract people, God's children, right? And then those people tend to, maybe just for, want of energy, they can't give it to everybody. In my experience, I've known lots of people like this. They're not so great with, their husbands or wives or children. I mean, I can't tell you about the number of leftists, me included, the number of children of leftists who were grossly neglected. Not so much abused, very little abuse, but a ton of neglect because, our parents were very busy saving the people, saving the working class, or actually leading and organizing in their minds and their fantasies the working class for revolution. And so, their children were secondary. So and I've heard that from so many friends of mine who were raised by Marxists and socialists. And to me, that's just the exact opposite of the kind of world I want to live in. If we all lived in a more self-interested world, I am quite sure, in other words, in a more conservative, in this sense, world, in which people cared a lot about those around them and very little or not at all about people they don't know, we would live in peace. I'm quite sure, or a lot more peace. I think there would be far less war. I mean, every war in this country was initiated by people who cared a whole lot about the people over there, and probably not so much about the boys they sent over to fight and die in that cause. So yeah, that's my politics of self-interest. I hope everyone appreciates that and adopts it immediately.
Yeah, well, that's the Brian McClanahan politics of think locally,
Oh,
act locally, right? That's the
totally.
yeah, that's a libertarian tradition. Honestly, that's the American tradition of federalism.
Paleo-conservative. Yeah. And this is why I have tremendous affection for paleo-conservatives. Just we differ on some other stuff, but man, I love that core value or core set of values in true conservatism. Edmund Burke conservatism, classical conservatism, paleo-conservatism. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So that's kind of the opposite, but we see that. And you see that only right now in American politics in MAGA. That's the only place you see that, right? Clearly the Democrats not only don't practice that, but they kind of shun it, and call it racist. If you don't care about other people, you're being a racist, transphobe, etc. MAGA, well, and the establishment Republicans, care a whole lot about the people of Ukraine, people they've never met. And they cared a whole lot about the people of Iraq before that and Afghanistan before that. They never met, But MAGA, I mean, J.D. Vance basically said, and got into a lot of trouble about this. He said, I don't care about Ukraine. I mean, in so many words, that's what he said it repeatedly during his when he was campaigning, not after he had won. That's how he won, by the way. J.D. Vance won in part by saying, I don't care about Ukraine. That's not our fight. It's not my country. That kind of, that self-interestedness is that, there you go, right there. That shows you that it's the path to peace, because if the Senate all believed like J.D. Vance that Ukraine was not our country, we would withdraw funding immediately and end the war tomorrow, which could happen. Mm-hmm. So self-interest is great for peace. And it's also great for avoiding imperialism in general, of all kinds: cultural imperialism, military imperialism. Nobody likes imperialism. Nobody likes someone coming into your neighborhood and telling you that you live incorrectly and that they're going to teach you how to live better, or maybe force you to live in a better way, the way that they live. That's imperialism. That is the spirit at the heart of imperialism, and it takes many forms, but no one likes that, and it causes, resentment, or worse. You tend to find people fighting back when they're faced with that kind of imperialism and self-interest. There you go.
So, okay, we talked a little bit about this on Unreported last time, but you're friends with a lot of Randians, people who read Ayn Rand and love her work, but you haven't read any of her. She talks about rational self-interest, right. and you've got this split with her where right. I think you believe in the self-interest part, but you don't believe in the rational part. Is that fair to say?
Correct. The rationalism part, the objectivism part. And again, no, I haven't read her, but I've talked to too many Randians, like a lot of Randians. And I've listened to and read Randians, and I've listened to her speak, but I just haven't read her books. But anyway, so as I understand it, yeah, that's my difference, is that love the self-interest part, but they have a moralism baked into their epistemology, right? Because if you believe that this, that, and the other thing is just a fact, and that the way to establish the truth is through the scientific method, you're putting a should in there. Because then the way to solve, like, let's say political problems or personal problems, but certainly political problems, is to feed them through the scientific process, put them through a microscope, count numbers, add things up, right? Objectify things. Then you'll find the correct solution to the political problem. That is the path of objectivism. And they believe that. That's what they say. They themselves say that. The problem with politics is not rational. It's not subject to the scientific method enough, right? If you just fed all the questions in politics through the scientific method, out would come the correct moral answer. They think that morality is also objective, like Sam Harris. That's Sam Harris's thing. I mean, I hope the way I described it kind of shows how absurd it is, and how, but more importantly, how authoritarian, and speaking of imperialist, it is, right? It is imperialist. There's a huge ought in there, which is that the Enlightenment is good and correct. That's what it is. That's a moral claim on behalf of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is good. The Enlightenment is the new God. That's what the Enlightenment was all about replacing the God of the church, who before then determined what was right and wrong and true and false, with this new God of science and rationalism and reason. That is our new Bible. That's how we will find what is good and true. And so of course it's moralistic at the heart of it, just like the church's God was moralistic at the heart of it. It's about good and evil. This is good. Science is now good and correct. It's both things. This is why we love it so much. If people don't have a problem with that, I don't know what else. It just seems so self-evidently ridiculous. But anyway, but then again, yes, I love the Randian self-interest piece, and I've heard her say this, and I've heard Randians talk like this. Although they tend to get moralistic really quickly and talk about what other people need and about what economic systems other people need to live under, by the way. I'm like, wait a minute, what if people genuinely want to live as communists, right? Which some people have. Don't you want to let them do that?
Well, so Michael Malice, talks about this too, and that he differs from the objectivists in a lot of ways. The main thing being that if you talk to objectivists for long enough, you'll get them to admit that basically what you need is a one-world government run by competent people in charge of everything based off of really strict rules. But
totally,
again, right. Rand was a novelist. She worked in fiction at her best. She worked in fiction.
Right.
And her villains were also selfish, I think, in that, like, but they used the language of altruism to mask their selfish motives and be weak in a selfish way.
There it is.
So her heroes were honestly selfish and saw strength as a virtue. Do you see strength as a virtue, or you know what I'm saying here?
I see it not as a virtue. I see it as being useful. Mm-hmm. Again, I guess I'm also utilitarian in that way. So I'm just amoral. I just think moralism is just a bad direction. You don't need it. There's no need for it. You can have exactly the world you want to live in without a scrap of moralism or morality even. No, strength, of course, is very useful, in the world, for getting things that you want, very few people have a value that doesn't require some strength to achieve, some objective in the world that doesn't require some kind of strength to achieve, either psychological or physical strength. So no, that's great. But like making it sort of this virtue, the way that I think Rand does, and the way America does, the way American culture does, the masculine virtue, although of course that's now receding, but, until recently, that was a big thing, the American cowboy, John Wayne, Rocky, Sylvester Stallone, the classic American masculine archetype, I guess, in which strength in itself is a virtue. And that's why men do like bodybuilding and build muscles up, because it just possessing strength, no matter what you do with it, is a virtue in some ways, in sort of the code of masculinity, the logic of masculinity, and American masculinity especially. So no, and then with Rand, she's sort of as I understand it, she kind of idealizes, or I should say, valorizes that kind of masculinity, but especially the psychological strength of masculinity, because it produces really good entrepreneurs, right? I mean, which is true. Now, if you do want to live in a better world materially, if you do want to fell forests and raise and build towns in them, and build bridges and have the internet and all that stuff, you need a lot of strength. You need a whole lot of fortitude. Exactly the stuff that Ayn Rand is prescribing, that she's talking about, that she's valorizing. So I just don't say that. I don't think it's a virtue, right? I just say that, yeah, if you want to get shit done, someone's going to need some strength. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Again, I've been reading Atlas Shrugged right now, so I'm in her fictional world in my
Oh, really?
headspace. It's
Oh,
a
wow.
psychedelic space to be in, you know.
We should do
Uh,
something. Maybe we should do something on Atlas Shrugged. Or I
yeah.
Randians have told me that the Fountainhead isn't that the more important one to hardcore Randians?
Well, Atlas Shrugged is like her masterwork, her magnum opus, but it can get redundant.
Hmm.
And the Fountainhead it's more captivating to a newcomer, I think,
Hmm.
in that the Fountainhead is about art, and so it's a lot easier to make the arguments when you're talking about like an architect with his own vision, as opposed to like how society should run and
Right.
how societies fall. You know?
Right. It's less explicitly political.
Yeah, it's less explicitly political,
Right.
and yeah, yeah,
Right. So right.
which does her a lot of favors. Yeah.
So if you're like a hardcore political Randian, right, then the Fountainhead is the place to go. That's where the important stuff is, right?
Mhm.
But in terms of,
And
yeah,
oh, it's easier to convince people, like if you're reading Atlas Shrugged, it can feel like you're being lectured to
I
sometimes.
was going to say, yeah. And if you're in terms of building the audience for these ideas, Atlas Shrugged is the
Mhm.
way to go. Need to be entertaining and engaging and accessible. Something that, and it's, Ayn Rand's, it's an amazing phenomenon. I don't know if anyone's ever written about the Ayn Rand phenomenon, because I mean, I was aware of it when I had no idea who she was, when I was a first year student at my little hippie left-wing anarchist college in Ohio. And I was like this little socialist from Berkeley, right? So far away from right-wing politics, you couldn't believe it. But there was one kid at my college who was like an Ayn Rand fan, and everybody knew about that. And that was, I think, true in high school too, right? There was always like one Ayn Rand kid, right? Who was the
Mhm.
usually obnoxious, kind of semi-autistic kid who was a know-it-all and would interrupt the teachers to tell them what actually was true. And
Mhm.
I just remember thinking like, ooh, that's where the evil is. That's the dark shit, man. Watch out for that. Don't go into that stuff, because you'll end up being a Republican or something really terrible. You won't care about
Mhm.
people if you read Ayn Rand. But she nonetheless, even though she was shunned, and I'm talking about shunned, even just in sort of normal liberal circles, like normie establishment circles, Ayn Rand is not cool. And if you're found, I mean, it's been looked down upon forever. I mean, I know whenever I hear Ayn Rand mentioned, someone scoffs at it, makes a joke about it, mimics her or something, or mocks her. So to be in that environment as a political intellectual, especially posthumously when you're dead and you can't defend yourself and you can't be in the media making yourself relevant, the way in which those books have just maintained their popularity among young people for decades and decades and decades, and it seems to not be slowing down at all, even in the middle of like
Mhm.
liberal enclaves like my college or Berkeley or whatever. Like that, there were always kids reading that book, and more importantly, like it reshaped the way they saw the world. And I have since then known hundreds and maybe thousands of people whose minds were totally changed by Ayn Rand's books. Um,
Mhm.
and I should read them to find out why. But what?
Yeah, the Anthem is a great place to start too. It's
Okay.
like a 100-page dystopian novel that's, I think it's on par with like Orwell and everything else. But a big thing about hers is like, in order to say "I love you," the first word is "I." So you have to recognize yourself first. Like you are the central starting point of everything that you do, and if you have no respect for yourself, then how can you have respect for anything else? You know?
Right.
Mhm.
Yes, exactly. Right. Do you actually respect the people of Bangladesh? First of
Mhm.
all, right? If you don't respect yourself or your own family, the people around you, but people in your own life, people who are individually important to you. Yeah, no, I agree. And then how can you move forward with any integrity and authenticity if you don't respect yourself? If you don't
Mhm.
place yourself really above others and above all other things? I don't quite see. I mean, again, that's it. She is attacking a Christian very basic Christian virtue, right? Selflessness is at the heart of Christianity, and it is therefore at the heart of leftist politics too, right? That's what she's going after. It's at the heart of communism, but but the communists got that from the Christians, right? Sacrifice yourself. This is what it says. This is what Paul says in Romans, epistle to the Romans. Sacrifice yourself to serve God. Sacrifice your members, he said, your body, your parts, depends on the translation, but it means, like, it's been interpreted as meaning sacrificing your individual interests and desires, bodily, psychologically, all the desires, all the interests and desires that are just yours, sacrifice them on the throne, sometimes it's said, right? For God, for God's purpose, to build a holier world. And in that, and also he's very clear, Paul is, and also this is in other parts of the Bible too, and this is well known, evangelism, right, is about sacrificing yourself for other people, for God, other God's children. So to serve God, you sacrifice yourself in the service of other human beings, other people on earth, right? So that, I mean, that's clearly like the heart of evangelicalism, and it should be very clear that it's also at the heart of leftist politics. Ever since Rousseau and the French Revolution, that's what every leftist has been preaching. That kind of Christian selflessness. They just talk about it as being in service of this political cause, which is always the state, not God. So they just replaced God with the state. It was quite a trick. I mean, that's what the Enlightenment ultimately accomplished. They just, the epistemology changed, the way we ascertain truth certainly changed, right? We did replace scripture with the scientific method, but the morality didn't leave. And this is why Republicans and conservatives are totally right when they say we're a Judeo-Christian country. We are. The moral system was not affected really significantly by the Enlightenment. It was just transmogrified into modern politics, and God was replaced by the state. That's for liberalism and leftist politics, both. Yeah, so Ayn Rand she likes the Enlightenment epistemology, but she attacks the Christian morality that actually undergirds it. And so I'm split. So I'm on, I like half of what she's doing and I hate the other half.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, yeah. For all those Christian conservatives out there, how hard is it to find a conservative Christian church nowadays? You know what I mean? Like, a lot of the like Methodist churches and a lot of the Unitarians are very progressive. Like, Anacoccian says this a lot too, and that we're all liberals nowadays. Like, liberalism is the water that we swim in. Just, we have so many liberal assumptions that we don't even know about. And all these Democrat politicians call themselves Christians, and I believe them. I believe that in their heart, they really see themselves as in line with the Christian ideology, even if they don't show up to church. They feel like they're serving a higher purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, this is like a side note, I actually think classical conservatives are not, I think liberals and leftists are better Christians than classical conservatives. Because
more ideologically consistent Christians, more ideologically consistent.
Yes, because the Bible doesn't distinguish between local and universe and global, right? I mean, you're supposed to care about everybody. And that's Christianity, right? I mean, no one denies that. I mean, it's a universalistic religion. It's universalistic. Paleocons, classical conservatives are not. They're anti-universalistic. That's the whole point. That's their entire point. So yeah, the Rousseauvians, the Marxists, the Bernie Sanders, well, no, actually, he's more of a nationalist, but the true socialists, like, Rousseau and Marx and their progeny, were, of course, always universalistic. They didn't make any distinctions among the working class or among people, except by class, not by nation. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so yeah, Ayn Rand, it's a fascinating thing why that particular combination of Enlightenment epistemology, rationalistic epistemology, and basically Christian morality, I think, or no, anti-Christian morality, amorality, has been appealing to so many 17-year-olds in America.
Yeah.
It's always 17-year-olds. It's always teenagers.
Yeah.
And by the way, a lot of girls too. I've known lots and lots of girls who were totally into Ayn Rand at that age.
Mhm.
And like normie girls, not political. Like I've known lots of like totally normie girls who, as teenagers, loved Ayn Rand. That is
Mhm.
really an interesting thing because they're trained every day and night to be, to have in Christian morality. We are all of us,
Yeah.
even socialists in Berkeley are trained in Christian morality all the time. And maybe that's it. It's just like she was the original punk rock.
Well, she's also a novelist, and women I do believe read fiction more than men, and sure, Michael Malice humorously calls her a vampire romance novelist, and there's some truth to that, in that she was boy crazy, and her novels are very very horny,
That's quite a
and
boy crazy is quite a delicate way of putting it.
yes,
Quite polite of you.
yeah, yeah.
um,
Uh,
right, right. It's kind of funny to think that whenever I see interviews with her, it's kind of wild to think that she was a freak, she doesn't seem that way. She doesn't project that at all. But so wait, what's the point about her sexuality though?
oh, that's why she also appeals to women in some stances. Is that
Oh, I see. Oh,
a lot of women would love to read a book about an architect and a journalist and their escapades.
gotcha. Right. It's the sex that sells to women. The
Yeah,
sexuality.
yeah.
Sexuality.
Well, I mean,
Oh,
romance
I know why.
novels. Yeah.
Strong masculine men.
Yes.
Boom. The
I mean,
characters.
like 50 Shades of Grey is about a billionaire, right?
Totally.
Like romance novels, the heroes are, I mean, the objects of desire are often Randian heroes in some sense, or wild
Right.
men who take what they want.
Aggressive, super masculine men have been the heroes of every dime novel in American history. They've been the central characters in every sort of like what's called like lowbrow women's lit. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, well, right. Not surprising.
Mhm.
Don't tell the feminists.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about feminism. That's another question we've got as an AMA. Are you still a feminist? Does the word feminism mean anything to you anymore?
Yeah, depends on how you define
Yeah.
it. But I mean,
Hmm.
equality under the law, of course. I mean, that'd be a weird one. It's hard to imagine. Very few precincts within American culture that would actually want, I think, women to be legally inferior, subordinate.
Well, I
Maybe.
do think the repeal of the 19th Amendment movement is starting to gain some traction,
Yeah.
and I don't know if they're conservative pick-me women online, but a lot of women, I think this started with Ann Coulter, are saying, yeah, the 19th Amendment wasn't a great idea.
Coulter saying that?
Yeah, she's been saying that for a
Oh,
decade or
really?
so now.
Well, if
Yeah.
she's saying it, I guess it's not such a tiny little movement, but I don't think it's anywhere near being mainstream. Well, anyway, so that's my position. I favor equality under the law. And I think that's it. I think that's it. Any any form of sexism that is manifested, and of course there is sexism and it is manifested all the time, I believe is best countered individually, not socially, not through mass shaming, not through the passage of laws, not through the enforcement of laws, but by dealing with it directly, which is to leave your husband.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of feminists talk about like 90s feminists. I love the 90s feminists in that like I can understand them and I can see where they're coming from and they seem like fun to hang out with sometimes. But they would talk about how they would experience sexism, like a man expecting them to cook for them,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
certain
Yeah,
office.
don't fuck him. That's the answer.
Yeah.
I mean it. Like that. Don't date him. Don't marry him. What's the
Hmm.
problem? Why would you want to be with that guy? You want to
Hmm.
correct him, make him different so then you can marry him? Is that the objective? No, just go somewhere else, right? This is the free market talking, I mean, that's the answer. Relationships, dating, that's a market too. And um, you know, there's a market for wives and husbands and treat it that way. Treat it like a market.
Hmm.
Go somewhere else. take your money or whatever somewhere else. But that's not the way feminists go. Feminists since Betty Friedan in 1961 with the feminine mystique have been saying, no, we need to make this a cultural issue. We need to get into the media, write books, and shame men and conservative women and all Americans to pass laws that require the government to regulate our equality, to make sure that we are always equal in many ways, not just legally, not just under the law, but equal in employment. And this is where equity comes in. This is where equity came in. The equality in outcomes came in then very quickly in the 70s and 80s. That kind of crept in, and by the 90s it was encoded and codified, and it was the law of the land equity. So what a disgusting, horrific, the right wing is completely right about equity. I mean, my goodness gracious, it is just so grotesque and racist, and also just a terrible way to organize society, and very Rousseauian. It's very like old school egalitarian Rousseauian, leveling. It's very 18th and 19th century shit there. Equity. Anyway, so yeah, feminism. So I also love another brand of feminism, which has been called sex positive feminism. And in some ways, like, my politics are kind of just sex positive feminism taken to its logical conclusions, which came about in the late 70s and early 80s in the so-called porn wars. This is when Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, and Jerry Falwell had a movement against pornography that became quite successful and actually produced.
Well, it's resurfacing right now.
I know, no, totally, yeah, and it actually they produced at least one municipal ordinance that banned pornography. I think this was in Minneapolis. I think Minneapolis banned the sale of porn within the city limits for a while, but I think there was another place too. So thank God there was a little group of feminist intellectuals beginning in the 1970s and 80s, and Ellen Willis is my favorite of all time. I knew Ellen in New York. She died about 10 years ago. I've just been a huge fan of hers. Everybody should read her. She's a super socialist, lefty feminist, but man, she is awesome on sex and sexuality and about culture and stuff, and about what feminism should really mean. I'm an Ellen Willis feminist. And she and the sex positive feminists that she kind of led in some ways argued that women should embrace and express their sexuality and not be ashamed of it, and not be ashamed of what Puritan Victorian America has told them about their bodies and about their desires. And that and this is the important part, the sex positive feminist said, don't, when someone shames you for being a slut, don't try to pass a law against them or even be concerned about them. Live your life. Be a slut if you want to, have sex with men and enjoy it and talk about it, right? The way that men do, and forget about what other people say, and just keep living the way that you want to live. And lo and behold, that's what we got. And I know some people watching or listening will think that this sexual revolution was, bad and stuff, but I'm sorry, please go back to 1960, before the birth control pill, before the sexual revolution, before sex positive feminism. You trust me, guys, you don't want to live in that world. Women were miserable in large part because they were very frustrated sexually. This, by the way, was their own doing. I'm not blaming the patriarchy. I'm blaming Puritanism and Victorianism, which had patriarchal elements in it, but women were voluntary participants.
Women were the main enforcers of those, yeah.
They were the main enforcers. Thank you, totally, exactly. Yeah. They were the main cops, always, just like with temperance. All the sex purity movements and temperance movements were all led by women. We all know this. So the sex positive feminists said, fuck that tradition. They were very well aware that the suffragists were arch Puritans who were leaders of the temperance movement and the sex purity movement. They were the ones who led the campaign against prostitution in the early 20th century. They were the ones who led the fight for prohibition. They were prohibitionists. That's what the temperance movement, that's what the suffragists were. So the sex positive feminists rejected that core element of feminism and said, let's go our own way with our own bodies. Thank you very much. And if the patriarchy tries to stop us, we'll just keep doing what we want to do. And that's what we got. They won. They won. Young women in America today, I think, are far freer, and maybe for better and worse, but they are freer. And if you value individual freedom, you should celebrate this. I'm sorry, but they are far, far, far freer than their grandmothers were at that age. They can do so much more with their body, express themselves more freely. I know it often manifests as stupid TikTok videos, and it often manifests as, I don't know, the hookup culture. And I guess there's a problem with that. Lack of relationships. I think, relationships are on a decline among your generation and stuff. Sure. I know there's consequences to freedom. It's weird. Things happen that we don't like when people are free. And a lot of libertarians, by the way, talk mad game about freedom all the time until it comes to sexual freedom. And in particular, the sexual freedom of women. Many libertarians are basically just Puritans who are not actually for freedom. They are for people all living like Ron Paul, wearing a suit and tie with a nice wife who's been his wife since he was a teenager, never talking about sex, not doing drugs, being straight edge, being a good American, basically, so the state doesn't have to control you. That is the classical liberal and often libertarian position on such things. And I'm not down with that, And the point is, though, that they often end up shaming people, especially women, for being sexually free. And this comes in the anti-sex work rhetoric coming out of a lot of libertarians. A lot of the anti-trans stuff is actually just anti-gay, and you can see it. You can see that part of what bothers them is that this is gay stuff, and they just don't like gay stuff. Women and men being gay. They're puritanical scolds, I'm sorry to say. And, I've known this since I started hanging out with libertarians. I knew that there was a tension between us. And fortunately, a lot of them are willing to talk about such things, unlike the left. But, that's something I would love for people to think about more.
Yeah.
Are we really for freedom? Are we really for freedom or not? Individual freedom? Because they're all about like letting people have guns and doing whatever the fuck they're not, and trusting that they'll do on average the right thing with guns, but they won't do that with people's bodies necessarily. I know they won't pass laws. I understand that, but there is such a thing as shame and pain associated with shame that is coercive, and in many cases much more coercive than law. Shame is
Well,
far
yeah, the
more
Hoppian,
shame.
yeah, the Hoppian philosophy and the Rothbard thing is all about, well, we can't use laws, so we must use shame.
Right, they say it. Yeah, and it's
yeah.
it's a rational argument. I'm not saying it's stupid. I'm asking whether you want to live in a world like that, and also, but more importantly, are you really for freedom? I mean, and why would you want to shame a woman to not do sex work? Why is sex work bad for you, especially libertarian? I would love we need to have a debate.
Okay.
We need to do a debate between libertarians on this, because I need to hear the argument why libertarians should be opposed to sex work.
Well, just in general, like, forget libertarianism, but like all of human history, right? Life is brutal. The sexes are more polarized than they are now. Like, I'm a little bit of a gender essentialist here, but let's face it, you had to have mothers and you had to have fathers, and men had to get with women, and to be safe, they had to be in some sort of pair coupling, some sort of marriage. So you needed to find a partner,
Right.
And if as a woman you didn't find somebody to protect you by a certain age, your only option was prostitution to some extent. So
Right.
like in the past, there were like a much larger percentage of the population were sex workers or just straight up prostitutes than they are nowadays, right? Like I think Victorian England.
Well, in terms of sex workers who have direct physical contact with their clients, yes. In terms of sex workers, we have far more sex workers now because, of course, cam girls and the like,
well,
OnlyFans.
And also, if you ask a pimp, everybody's a sex worker. Everybody uses sex to their advantage in some way. Like,
absolutely, yeah, right, or at least should be using it to their advantage. That's Maggie McNeil's whole thing. Career sex workers. She's always like making fun of women who give it away for free. Like, why would you do that? Men will do things for you.
But if you cared about the woman in your life, a woman who's a family member of yours, like a sister or a daughter, you would want them to avoid sex work as much as possible. For most of human history, it was a sign that they did not partner with somebody who would protect them.
Um, yeah, just that's not true for me though. I mean, um, not necessarily. I mean, there are some forms of sex work I certainly wouldn't feel, comfortable with.
But that's the cause of the stigma, is what I'm saying. Is that sex work used to be a lot more dangerous. It's a lot
Oh,
safer now,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
and ideas of purity and honor sort of arose from this sort of necessity.
Well, so in this country, there actually wasn't really an anti-prostitute stigma until the 19th century. So it wasn't until the feminists came along. They really were the leaders of this, by the way. They really were. I mean, they actually convinced Christians, to join in the social purity campaigns. This was like late 19th century when this started. Before then, as you know from my book, and people know from my book, like prostitution was all over the place in all the cities and most of the towns in this country, and was the laws against it were unenforced, and prostitutes were often like big figures in their towns and cities. They were famous and celebrated. I mean, there was some shaming, but like, man, prostitutes were like celebrities, in the 19th century, until the feminists came along and said, we've got to prove to men that we are just like them. And so we got to shut down this prostitute thing. So no, there wasn't this is not an old stigma. This is actually a pretty new stigma. It's only like 150 years old.
Mm-hmm. Uh, these weren't thought of though as a house of ill repute, so to say.
What do you mean?
Oh, just yeah, that there was still a stigma around these prostitution houses. I guess. Okay, I see what you're saying now.
No, but I mean, no,
I
I
see a
like,
circular logic. Yeah,
no, but
yeah,
I love your deep anthropological dive there. I mean, I had never thought of that. I didn't know. I'm serious.
yeah.
I didn't know. I think
Uh-huh.
there probably is a deeper stigma too. I'm sure
Hmm.
in some, and certainly in some societies. I'm just talking about America. That's all. And I'm talking about
Hmm.
the last 300 years. As everyone
Hmm.
knows, prostitution's always been around all over the world. So, and each society, each culture deals with it differently. I mean, this is the main, I'm
That's an
just talking about
yeah.
America.
Your
But
analysis of the 19th century is really interesting because people talk about like the sex positivity of nowadays, women acting like men and being like dogs, the way men are sexually dogs.
mhm,
But you're talking about the purity of the 19th century being women trying to be like men, proving how temperate they could be.
controlled and disciplined.
Yeah.
That's right, because that's what the businessmen were, back to Ayn Rand,
Mhm.
right? The great robber barons, the people, the men who were building this country, building the steel factories and the railroads and all that stuff. They were super disciplined people. Rockefeller and Carnegie, these guys didn't have any fun at all. They worked all the time. We know this. The men who worked in their factories, right? They worked 10, 12 hours a day sometimes, incredible discipline to build this country at that time. And they said, we can't be whores, hanging out in whorehouses, getting drunk and fucking men all day long. That's not a good look in an advanced industrializing economy, and also in a democracy, right, where you're supposed to be responsible for the community. Being a whore looks self-interested, looks
Mhm.
very self-interested, right? And also very, it was considered that they were also libertines, right? Whores were known as libertines for good reason. I mean, a lot of women who chose to be in sex work are women who like sex a lot. I mean, that's why many of them have chosen that work. It's just true. Ask a porn star. So, yeah, so the feminists said, no, we can't do that. We've got to look like these austere, disciplined robber barons like John D. Rockefeller, who just sat in his chair all day working. We can't be sexual. We can't be of the body. We need to be of the rational mind. We need to join with this enlightenment stuff, this enlightenment, industrial democracy stuff, this modernity stuff, this discipline and modernity. So being a whore isn't going to work. We will never get the
Mhm.
vote if they think we're a bunch of whores. So that's
Yeah.
why that's why the social purity movement happens in the late 19th century, and that's why the women get the vote 20 years, 30 years later, 1920. It's
Mhm.
amazing how that works.
Yeah, man, I think when men become sexually conservative in some ways, a lot of it has to do with loneliness. In that, when
Mm.
you're lonely, you tend to idolize others and you see them as perfect beings. And I think that, like, you want to project that everybody else is perfect, and so you want to imagine the opposite sex as being completely temperate and perfect and only loving you and completely
Mm.
loyal, you know. Whereas people who aren't lonely and have better social connections, I think in a less isolated world, we're more aware of our flaws.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't loneliness engender feelings of rejection from the other sex, by the other sex, or by whatever we're
Yeah,
attracting?
I think you can project that easily. I think that's a symptom. Yeah,
Yeah, and then that's where the misogyny comes from among incels. Like, why is it that incels hate women? It's because they feel rejected by them, isn't it?
hmm yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they turn that into like a self hatred thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, but yeah, I think a
But the
lot of the gender wars
idealization,
now. Yeah,
the
yeah,
idealization is big, and that probably has something to do with the mother figure in
sure.
our minds. The mother is unfortunately kind of where everyone's sexuality starts.
Mhm.
Freud famously wrote about this. I mean, she's the first woman we know, and so our idea of woman is formed with our mother, of course, just like our idea of man is formed with our father. I mean, that's just
Mhm.
fact. And so unfortunately, it's kind of weird and gross, but our sexuality is some derivation of our relationship with our mother.
Well, yeah,
Um,
anthropologically too, you could say that your parents are an example of a successful pair bond, and you want to emulate that.
if you want to go evolutionary,
If
sure.
you want to go evolutionary biology, yeah, I know.
I'm telling you,
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
parents were not a successful pair bond. No.
Okay.
No, evolution played no role in my family situation, or certainly in my sexuality. I don't think. Although I can imagine lots of people screaming at me right now. Of course it did. Um, don't you know that this was an advantage in 5,000 BC, and therefore you jerk off to this porn now? Something. Uh, we I This evolutionary psychology thing, man, I shouldn't spout off too much against it, but because I haven't really read it, but every time I hear it, I I reach for my gun. I don't like it, and it doesn't make sense. And I think it sounds really fallacious to me. It always sounds like a post hoc rationalization. Oh, such and such a thing happens now. Well, that must be because it was advantageous to the species X number of years ago. Um, why, first of all,
Well,
why do we
yeah.
need to biologize, social I hate that biologizing social questions. Um, Keep it out of the biologist's hands. Thank you very much. I mean, Brett Weinstein's a nice guy and he's pretty smart and all, but I don't want him making the decisions for us through biology.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
yeah, I think well, so like the big figures of leftism I think are Darwin, Freud and Marx. And I think a lot of the followers of Darwin make the same mistakes that the followers of Freud and Marx make
Which is
in
what?
that no, just dogmatism essentially, and
Oh,
you discover like Marx is really a classical economist at heart, and then he had Engels be a political propagandist for him,
right.
but he's got some insights about the economic condition of the time that he lived in, and he made some predictions about how that would pan out, but that doesn't mean that he created the perfect system for us all to live in.
Oh yeah, right. Well, I mean, Marx spends very little time describing socialism or talking about it. Like
Yeah.
he has almost no prescriptions for how to work the thing. Should there be like community councils that run things? Should there be a giant state with various branches and executive? And no, he doesn't have any answers to that stuff. He talks in very big generalities and abstractions. He just talks about the state.
Yeah.
Doesn't talk about socialism. But yeah, Marxists were the problem. And in fact,
Well,
Marx
yeah.
allegedly said this, something like God save me from the Marxists because of what they did with his ideas. But
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So the reason why I brought up feminism in the first place, I think, is more so that intersectionality came out of feminism. The Norman Finkelstein interview had a lot to do with intersectionality and his problems with it. But intersectionality came out of feminism, and then the trans movement, in a lot of ways, came out of intersectionality. And nowadays, anybody I see carrying the feminist banner consistently calling themselves feminists are what would be called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists,
yeah.
which is the slur that they get called. But they seem to be on team pro woman, and that the word the only people really defending feminism in a logically consistent way seem to be anti-trans right now in some regards.
Yeah. So the trans movement is derived from feminism. Second wave, 1960s, 1970s feminism. So until the 1960s, it was commonly, almost universally believed that various characteristics and behaviors were biologically determined in females, that females were essentially biologically determined to be mothers and wives and to be sexless and selfless, virtuous in those ways. So those were biological, immutable characteristics, right? And so second wave feminists come along and they want to work in corporations and they want to run for president, right? They want to do all these things outside the home. They don't want to be wives and mothers for whatever reason. So they have to attack that central core undergirding justification, right? They have to say, no, biologically, nothing is holding us back. Nothing is holding us back from being a CEO or a senator. So they attack that gender essentialism. This is where we came up with this whole concept of gender essentialism, was the feminists. The idea that these things are immutable, that like the interest in pink, or dolls or being a mom, were born into you. You were born with them if you were a female. That had to be attacked, right? If you were a woman who wanted to be a CEO of a corporation. And so they did. And so they became professors. And so they invented gender studies. And so they invented the concept of gender as a social construct. And they invented the concept of gender essentialism, and they attacked gender essentialism. They said, no, we are not determined by our bodies. Our body is not our destiny. We can do whatever we want as women. And so that opened the door for what we see today, the trans movement, because then along comes some people who say, yeah, you're right. Not only are women not biologically determined to live in the kitchen, but they're not also biologically determined to be like women in any way. That you can be born with the female parts, but not want to be in the kitchen at all, not want to be a wife at all. You could even want to be just like a man. In fact, you could even want to be a man. Why not? So once gender essentialism was demolished, which it basically was, that opened up all the possibilities. And this is basically the core of the freak out now. The conservative movement is now finding out about this shit that's been going on since the 1960s, because they literally didn't really know about it. Now they're seeing it. They're seeing the end results of that movement in the trans movement, and they don't like it because it is fundamentally, radically, universally destabilizing. Because your daughter can become your son in one instance, right? And everything, all the hierarchies that we live by, the pairings, the way we organize our intimate lives, right? Everything is now up for question. None of this is true anymore, according to the trans movement. So I understand that fear. The problem with the trans movement is twofold. One is that they say they are now the essentialists. In fact, the shooter in Nashville, one of his, I don't fucking care, its art that I saw.
Female to male, yeah.
Right. Well,
the media's been saying her, so I'm cool with saying her. Yeah.
Trans man, whatever the fuck. Anyway.
Yeah.
I like it, especially in this case. Its art included some poster that it made saying "born this way." That's essentialism. No, you weren't.
Yeah.
I mean, according to second wave feminism and the original gender ideology, you weren't born anyway. And it's not necessarily choices that are made, like conscious choices, but your sexuality begins at birth. It doesn't start at birth. I mean, isn't finished at birth. So, so they become and so they say, no, we were born this way. I was born with a penis, but I know I was born with him as a man. I mean, as a woman. I know that in my heart. I am essentially a woman. And number two, they're aggressive and hostile and belligerent about it. But, those are the two problems. But yeah, so that's to me the fundamental problem with the trans movement now, is that they've become the new gender essentialists and therefore the new authoritarians, right? So Yeah, but it does derive from feminism, second wave feminism.
Yeah, I'm trying to square this with self-interest in that like the trans movement seems so self-obsessed. Like all they do is
Oh yeah.
spend their entire lives just ruminating and meditating over who they really are, who the real them really is.
No, but it's not a politics of self-interest, because
Uh-huh.
what are they concerned about all the time? What is their political concern? Their political concern is what you and I think. That's
How
their
others
state,
perceive them and how others treat them, and
how we
yeah.
feel about them, how we think about them, what laws we pass about them. It's all about us. It's all about other people. So Deirdre
Mhm.
McCluskey, who's been on Unregistered, who's a esteemed historian and economist, transitioned from man to woman. I think it was 1997. I know it was many years ago, many decades ago, long before all this stuff happened. And I've been in Deirdre's house. I sat with her and interviewed her in her house for hours, spent time with her. I mean, number one, she just seems very comfortable. You can watch her amazing interview on Dave Rubin's show, by the way. Deirdre McCluskey on Dave Rubin. I strongly recommend that. This is years ago before Rubin joined the anti-trans hysteria stuff. And it's the most thoughtful discussion about being a trans person that I've ever seen or heard. It's really, really wonderful. For me, Deirdre she's just comfortable in herself. And she basically says, I don't care what you think about me. I don't care what pronoun you use for me, because I know who I am and I'm happy with who I am now. And that's the end of that conversation. And that's the end of that topic, because I'm here. I've made it and I've got what I want. And I don't need you. I don't need your affirmation. I don't need to be liked by you. If you don't like me, I don't want to spend time with you. So who cares? So the trans movement is narcissistic in that way, in that it seeks to bend and conform the world around their own individual self-conception. It's very imperialistic, right? Trans people are super interested in changing your mind and my mind and all the minds of all the people, so that we see the world differently, so that we see the world the way that they see it. So that's narcissism. That's not the politics of self-interest.
Hmm.
That's why
It
that's
reminds
why I
me
don't
of
like it.
yeah. It reminds me of the In Living Color sketch where Jim Carrey is a gay man and he's at a restaurant and he just takes every opportunity to tell everybody in that restaurant that he's gay. Like, I'll have a cheeseburger for the homosexual, like,
Exactly. Right.
yeah,
But
yeah,
that's about basically coercing the audience into loving you. So again, it's about
yeah.
coercion, it's about manipulation, coercion of other people. Doing other people, getting the laughter, right? It's about other people affirming you. Malcolm X said, fuck white people. Don't care about white people. Who cares if they're racist, so what? Go build your own thing, black people. Build your own land, build your own nation, build whatever you want to make you happy. And that's all you need. Why are you so worried about the white man, right? That's actually, it's a weird form of white supremacy, actually. The civil rights movement was based on is about sort of a weird form of white supremacy. It was all about changing the minds of white people. It's about white people being the most important people on earth. And this is the current race movement, the current BLM type movement. It's all about shame. It's all about white people and what we think and how we think about black people. That's all that matters. That's the most important thing. That determines their destiny. That has determined their history. Black people, everything about them has been determined by me and white people, by other people. So again, it's about other people. It's not about your goddamn self. Build your own happiness,
Mhm.
build your own identity, build your own city, build your own community, and stop worrying about other people. There you go.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my manifesto.
uh,
Take it or leave it.
mhm, mhm,
Do we have another
mhm.
question, or should we wrap? I feel like we should wrap.
We'll wrap up soon. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry, I wanna finish the circle here.
sure.
So there's one more criticism. There are two criticisms of the Finkelstein episode.
Okay, good.
One was, why are you talking to communists at all? How is this guy a Maoist? Why are you talking to communists anymore?
Yeah.
And then the second criticism was that Finkelstein seems to be really dismissive of identity politics at all, and that he hasn't actually read Kimberly Crenshaw, and that he's overly dismissive. That every time you bring up identity politics or the literature, he just says, "Oh, there's nothing there. There's nothing there," as opposed to engaging with the arguments. And I think famously, you still think that there's something to gain from Kimberly Crenshaw and that generation of identity
Oh,
politics.
definitely. Yeah. So why do I talk to communists? So he's not the first communist I've talked to. I've had many communists on my show, maybe not Maoists, although I might have had somebody who was at some point a Maoist. I've had lots of Marxists on the show, lots of socialists and communists of various kinds. I've had fans of the Soviet Union on the show, you know.
Yeah.
They
Also, side note on that, Mike Tyson famously has a tattoo of Mao on him, and he's like a right wing hero nowadays. He voted for Trump, so it's funny.
Oh, I know, yeah. Mao's on his, where is it on his body? I forget.
I,
It's,
I think it's chest. I think.
yeah, not his face,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So unregistered is about what you're not supposed to say, saying things you're not supposed to say. So every Marxist I've had, every socialist and communist I've had on the show has been a dissident within the left, has been an opponent of the establishment, of the dominant norms, and have been punished for it. Okay, so that's why Norman was on the show, because clearly, I mean, he's always been a dissident on the left. He's always been of the left, but a fierce critic of the left at the same time. So like with Israel, I mean, liberals hate Norman Finkelstein's guts. They hate his guts because they all are, they stand squarely behind Israel. He now is, a fierce opponent, obviously, of the woke left, the new left. And clearly, I mean, and he's gotten a lot of punishment for it. You can watch him on other shows. He's been attacked in many ways because of this stuff. So that's why. And he's also, quite brilliant and a great writer and he's also a great historian. I mean, everyone should read the Holocaust Industry. We didn't really get to talk about that. That's what made him famous back in the 90s, which is a tremendous argument about how Zionists in the 1940s and 50s began constructing the narrative of the Holocaust and creating the truth about what the Holocaust was to further the interests of the state of Israel, and to consequently expel many, many Palestinians from that area for that purpose. So it has been what we know of, the way we think about the Holocaust was created by the original Israelis, basically by the state of Israel. And it's been used ever since then to further the interest of Israel, to argue consistently for further and further economic and military aid from the United States to Israel. If you don't give us these fighter jets, there will be another Holocaust, is what they have said every year since 1948, and they've gotten their wishes, right? They've managed to create a feeling of guilt among the entire world, but especially in the West, based on their narrative of the Holocaust. Now, Norman Finkelstein does not say the Holocaust didn't happen, nor, by the way, do people like David Irving, the most famous Holocaust denier. None of those people actually deny the Holocaust. They just say it was exaggerated in certain important ways. And that it was many, many Jews were murdered for sure. And the Nazis were, of course, violent anti-Semites, but it wasn't carried out in the ways that we are told. There were a lot of wrinkles in it. And therefore, there's less of a reason to have a state devoted to one ethnic and religious group. The only ethnic and religious group on earth that gets to have its own state protected by the rest of the world. Why are Jews so special? It's because the Holocaust industry has said from the beginning that the Holocaust was unique among tragedies. Unique. This was the worst thing that's ever happened to any human beings on earth, which almost on the face of it is ridiculous. But that's Norman's actual original work, which is really brilliant. So that's another reason I've had him on, because he's been a hero of mine for going against that orthodoxy since the beginning, so to speak, orthodoxy. But yeah, I mean, talk to Ben Burgis for half a second, man. You'll get schooled if you think you shouldn't talk to communists. Please go argue with Ben about just about any political issue. He'll probably run circles around you, and you'll learn a lot if you're listening. So that's why I talk to communists. The second question was.
Second question was, it seems like he's a little overly dismissive of
right.
Identity politics. Yeah.
He is. Yeah. And I what do I want to say about Norman? He and I are not the same. I mean, we dislike a lot of the same things in wokeness for sure. But yes, he sees nothing of value in the original critical race theory of Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell et al. I do. And I do believe that anyone who's listening, if they actually read those books and articles, they would see what I'm talking about and they would agree with me. They simply argue that American law and jurisprudence has been, even currently, shaped in large part around and because of racial assumptions or assumptions about race in American culture. So that our law does, in fact, carry forward our actually racist past. We all agree that the United States of America was officially racist previously, formally, legally racist, right? We all agree with that. And their argument is that the assumptions that were baked into that system, the system of segregation and slavery, carried forward when people have been making laws since 1965. People have been making laws since 1965, but it's not like the culture around race just went away entirely. And in fact, this is what Camille Foster and I are working on, or especially Camille, but the whole thing about the categories established by the slave masters of race, of the Negro, of the Caucasian, et cetera, we're still obsessed with. And in fact, it's the left and liberals who are doing this and carrying forward this set of ideas invented by slaveholders, for God's sake. And so, but that's true in sort of white supremacist ways too. I mean, especially if you look at some actual laws that were passed in the South after 1965, there's no doubt about it that the lawmakers were thinking in their minds of Negroes in a very particular way, in a very like racist way. There are racist assumptions baked into a lot of the law. And you can't see it. It's not explicitly racist because that's illegal. But, there are many ways in which the intended effect of the law was racist. And then the actual effect of the law was racist. Like if you go to Louisiana and go to a prison, you'll see what I'm talking about. Lots of black men are in prison. Same with the welfare state. Same with all sorts of things. So even if they are wrong in the specifics about how racist American law is, it seems like a pretty valid argument that's worth exploring. How much did the old assumptions about race seep into lawmaking since 1965? That seems a completely reasonable assumption, that there would be some seepage there. So that's CRT. That's the original CRT. That's what we've been screaming about for years now, and no one's read the stuff because they don't know.
I guess the moment that it became corrupted, so to say, I guess, is when lawyers became trained in this stuff and they found a way to use it to their advantage and shape policy into the future.
No, it was about the schools. It's about kids. It's
Okay.
about, and I feel this. I think conservatives are right. It ended up getting, so the way it's been interpreted recently is that white people are inherently racist, right? So the argument originally was American law was racist because of racist assumptions in lawmakers' minds. That has been sort of transformed into this idea that therefore white supremacy and racism is eternal in America, and therefore all white people are born racist. And that's what's getting taught in the schools and to children. And when conservatives found this out, they very righteously went berserk about it, as would I. Teaching children that they are either inherently racist or inherently oppressed is about the worst thing you can say to a kid. And I don't need to convince anybody listening to this, I'm sure, about that. But that's what happened. Just like the original feminist gender theory got corrupted and made essentialist, the original critical race theory got corrupted to some extent, or I should say kind of distorted and made into something it's not. It isn't really. It's something else. It's a critique of the law. That's it. Kim Crenshaw and Derek Bell teach at law schools. They're law professors. That's what this is about. It's not about white people being racist. That's not their argument. Their argument is about the law and how it was made and why it was made. So that's that. I feel like
Yeah, sweet.
feel like I've
Yeah.
done my service today. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
thank you, man.
One little note to
Yes.
little note to wrap things up. Your patrons support you. They find value in what you do. They're asking anybody you want to shout out that you listen to, any podcasts you like. I think fans of Unreported will hear us mention. It's blurred. Is that the Duran?
Ah, damn it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Duran. There we go.
Mhm.
Duran. Every single day I listen to the Duran, and they have subsidiary channels by Alex Mercouris and Alex Cristoforo, who are the hosts of the Duran. Everybody who cares at all about foreign policy should watch the Duran. And then I also am a big fan of Glenn Greenwald's new show, System Update, which is on Rumble only. It's one of the things I love about it, that it's on Rumble only, but it's Glenn Greenwald. So it's as rigorous and serious as journalism gets these days. And I mean, especially on our side of the aisle, it's the very best in terms of political analysis. And what else? Occasionally,
I was going to say,
go ahead.
Yeah. Who?
Jimmy Dore.
Oh, Jimmy Dore. Yeah.
Occasionally.
I was good. Yeah. I was going to say real quick, I mean, we bring him up every week, every time, but the Perfume Nationalist, the whole Ayn Rand conversation came from, he's famously the Fountainhead. He has that episode, and then his Atlas Shrugged episode was recent. And again, everything he does it's like a fun book club to follow along, and it gives me the best fodder for conversation with everybody in my life. And because it's about fiction and art and culture, as opposed to politics, there's less war happening all the time. There's more freedom for everybody to have their own opinions on things.
Totally. I see the world differently because of Jack. Perfume National has absolutely changed. I mean, I can't walk around my neighborhood without thinking about Jack. I can't look at houses without thinking about Jack. I can't go get food at some restaurant without thinking about Jack. I'm always thinking about, shit, is this neoliberal? This is I mean, it's become like a slur among like people I know. We call things neoliberal, right?
Same. Yeah.
We call like sandwiches neoliberal. And there's a real meaning to this, right? Or like watching Netflix. Yeah. Last night, I was thinking about Jack because I was watching some show and I was like, God damn, this is like neoliberal production values. Very spare and austere, no attention to like serious filmmaking, right? That's neoliberal. I mean,
the left, the left is catching on to that. I see, how the leftists will blame everything on capitalism. Like if it's raining outside, it's capitalism's fault. Right. They're starting to blame neoliberalism. And I think Jack has a huge part in that.
Oh yeah. So Perfume Nationalists. I mean, there's, it's for certain people, it's not the easiest podcast to get through because he talks about perfume at the beginning of every episode. And he talks about movies, and he talks about old movies at the beginning of every episode. So if you're not into those things and you're only into the politics, you got to wait a while. But don't do that because Jack will be very mad at you because it's art he's making, and you've got to experience the whole thing to really appreciate what he's doing. He's also telling one big story. Each episode it's not just that each episode is a work of art, it's the entire podcast, the whole run of the podcast together is one work of art. So he actually doesn't think you understand it unless you've listened to every episode. And I think he's right.
Same with Unregistered.
I agree.
Yeah.
To really get down deep into what the meaning of that podcast is, Unregistered, you should listen to the first 2 years when it was audio only and it was in person. That's when I established what this thing is. And you can really hear like the character of that and what I was aspiring to do then. So yeah. All right, man, we're good. Thank you so much for this.
Yep.
A lot of fun.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'll see you tomorrow.
Tomorrow night. Yeah.
At Unreported.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Michael.
Yep.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.